And you are podcasting with Gary DeMar. Let's figure things out.
When you talk about the end times, the last days, the rapture's right around the corner, etc., the verses that come to mind almost every time are Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, the 70 weeks prophecy, and supposedly contained in those verses, in 4 verses, you supposedly find the Antichrist, a rebuilt temple, a 7-year tribulation period, a covenant made with the Jews during that period of time. The covenant is then broken in the middle of that period of time. And then there's going to be a hell-born great tribulation that takes place during the last half of that 70th year, in which 2/3 of the Jews are slaughtered. All of those things are supposedly in those 4 verses. And I don't know if I mentioned that the temple is going to be rebuilt again. All of those things are contained within those 4 verses. I find that unbelievable that people actually believe that. No one, just reading through their Bible, would ever come to those conclusions based upon the reading of that passage. Even if you were just to ask somebody, tell me, do you see the Antichrist mentioned there? Well, they read through it and you say, well, I don't see anything mentioned about an Antichrist. Does it say anything about a 7-year tribulation period? Does it say anything about an Antichrist making a covenant with Israel and then breaking the covenant? No, you won't find any of that there. And then the most fascinating thing with this, if you go to Matthew chapter 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 17 and Luke 19 and Luke 21, you have a preponderance of verses, and contextually they're in a particular context, and that particular context is describing a temple that was in fact there at that time. Jesus says, looking at this temple, not one stone here will be left upon another. So here you have a prophecy talking about that particular temple. You have a particular prophecy where the second person plural is used throughout. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. You have in verse 15 of Matthew chapter 24, you have when you see the abomination of desolation. And then when you get to Matthew 24:34, it says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And so you have actually more than 3 chapters dealing with this big section of Scripture where the audience is known, the elements there as to what is going to take place is there. You know, this was a tribulation. You actually get the word tribulation it was local. You could escape it on foot by going to the mountains outside of Jerusalem. And so everything is local about this. Now, there's language in there about sun, moon, and stars and so forth, but that language is borrowed from the Old Testament. And that language is typical of judgments upon nations. And Jesus appropriates that language and brings that into the Olivet Discourse and says this is now going to happen to Israel like it happened to Babylon and Egypt, etc. And so, but no. All of that, no, that is going to refer to something that's distant in time when Jesus returns and raptures the church and the Antichrist takes place. And yet none of that is found even in those passages. There's nothing from Matthew chapter 21, Matthew chapter 25, which isn't indicative of something that's in the distant future. Now, some would say the end of chapter 25 is the second coming. Okay, fine. But all the other things in Matthew chapters 21, 22, 23, and 24 are obvious about that particular generation. And none of the things that you find in Daniel 9:24 through 27 are specifically mentioned there. There is the mention of the abomination of desolation, which of course comes from Daniel. But notice that the audience reference there is when you see the abomination of desolation. So here we got 4 verses that people go to and say, we find all of these things, a gap of 2,000 years between the 69th week and the 70th week. We find all these other elements in there, and yet when you get to the specifics of things in the Gospels, no. Don't pay any attention to the audience relevance. Don't pay any attention to the local nature of what was taking place there that could be escaped on foot. Don't pay any attention to the cultural indicators there, flat roofs, the Sabbath regulations still in check there, which is depicted the Sabbath day journey, which is mentioned in Acts chapter 1. Women grinding at the mill. It's obvious that this was a local judgment at that particular period of time. It's just amazing to me how the dispensationalists can find so much material in Daniel 9:24 through 27, and yet all the material that you find throughout in the Olivet Discourse and all those chapters, somehow that doesn't have anything to do with events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem that took place in AD 70. I mean, even Luke's gospel, which is parallel to Matthew 24 and Mark 13, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and that's exactly what took place. You can read about it in Josephus, but we don't need Josephus. Jesus said it was going to happen before that generation passed away. And so now let's look at the particulars of Daniel 9:24 through 27. And here are some questions. Does Daniel 9:24 through 27 contain information about a future end-time person called the Antichrist who makes and breaks a covenant with the Jews during a 7-year period based on the 70th week, that is the last 7 years of the 70 weeks prophecy? Is the Antichrist mentioned there? Well, no, he's not. And one of the problems with this is, does the modern definition of Antichrist fit the biblical definition of Antichrist found in 1 John 2:18, 1 John 2:22, and in 4:2, 1 John 4:2, and 2 John 7? If you're going to start talking about the Antichrist, where would you go to define what an Antichrist is? Well, you should go to those passages that actually use the word Antichrist. And so go to 1 John chapter 2, verse 18, verse 22, 4:2, 2 John 7, and look at the definition of Antichrist, and look at the number of Antichrist and the timing of the Antichrist. So if you're going to take an Antichrist doctrine and superimpose it on Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, how does their understanding of the Antichrist, which is a political entity who makes a covenant with Israel and then breaks the covenant, how does that square with what we find in 1 and 2 John? It doesn't at all. This is not a political entity who's about to take over the world and make a covenant with Israel. John doesn't say anything about that in the only passages in Scripture that use the word Antichrist. In fact, John goes so far as to say it's the fact that these Antichrists are alive in his day is an indication that it's the last hour. The last hour of what? Well, Jesus said, you don't know the day and the hour. He didn't know the day and the hour. But we did know the generation. And Jesus says this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. The fact that these Antichrists were alive in John's day was an indication that the hour was in fact near. And because it had to be, because if not, then Jesus didn't know what he was talking about, and he was in error, and why should we believe him about anything? And so there's a huge, huge problem here with trying to find the Antichrist in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. All right. So here's another question. Does Daniel 9, 24 through 27 contain information about a third temple that supposedly will be built during the final week of the 7 years that requires a gap of so nearly 2,000 years after the 69th week? Does it talk about another rebuilt temple? Because you have to remember something. When the Israelites came back from the captivity, they rebuilt the temple. And we know that they rebuilt the temple because we know during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes that the temple was defiled. And we also know that Herod began a rebuilding program of the temple that continued up to probably around the year AD 94, where it was 64, sorry, AD 64, and it was eventually destroyed in AD 70. So what you would have to say, if Daniel 9, 24 through 27 is talking about a rebuilt temple, you would have to say it skips over the actual rebuilt temple that was in existence in Jesus' day. And again, there's nothing in the text of Daniel 9, 24 through 27 that gives any indication that this skips over the actual rebuilt temple that took place after the captivity and was the temple in which Jesus entered, and it was the temple in which Paul actually preached, and it was at that temple where Paul was shut out of the temple. This is, again, none of that is found in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And there's a fellow on Facebook who continually talks about the literal interpretation, the grammatical interpretation, and the historical. Look at those three things. You got the interpreting the Bible literally. Well, there's nothing literally in Daniel 9, 24 through 27 that has all the elements that dispensationalists claim. What they're doing is importing things from their system back into Daniel 24 through 27. The idea of the history here, we know what the history was with the destruction of the temple in AD 70. You would then need something within the New Testament that says there's going to be another rebuilt temple. And there's nothing in the New Testament that says anything about another rebuilt temple. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 talks about the man of lawlessness who takes his seat in the temple. What temple was that? It was the temple that was still standing when Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. One would have to assume that Paul's talking about another rebuilt temple, even though that particular temple was in fact a rebuilt temple. So there are all kinds of problems here. And then again, you have to deal with the gap feature. The gap feature is, oh, wait a minute. The first 68 weeks, which takes you to 683 years, they're all consecutive. But then all of a sudden, the 70th week of that prophecy, which turns out being 7 years, is the prophecy clock stops at the end of the 483 years. And then God is going to deal with the church, and so he's going to put the prophecy clock on hold for Israel so far for 2,000 years, and then when the rapture takes the church off the earth, then that's the beginning of the 70th week of years, which is supposedly when the Antichrist comes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where is that? Where do you find that in the 70th week, 70 weeks of years prophecy? There's none of that's in there. There's no mention of a gap. The 70 follows 69. That's crucial to understand this prophecy. Why is that 7 years, the final 7 years, important? Because it's Jesus who inaugurates the final 7 years. His ministry began at the beginning of that 70th week of years. That's so. And then what you end up happening is that Jesus is cut off in the middle of that 70th week. And so the first 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry fulfills the first half of that final week of 7 years. And then the gospel goes out to Israel, and then you find that then the gospel, there's this indictment. You have Stephen in Acts chapter 7 indicting his generation. You find in chapter 2 it talks about, escape this. How do they escape from this evil generation? And that was the gospel. And so the gospel goes out, and then Stephen gets up and he indicts that generation. Paul comes, stones him to death. And then from that, we see this persecution of the church by Saul, and basically that's the end of the 70th week. And so now some say, oh, no, we got the gap of 40 years, and the last 3.5 years is a lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Again, the problem with that is there's no mention of a gap in time. In fact, if you were to go and look at all the times numbers are given for some event, there's not a single time in Scripture where a certain number of days, weeks, or years are given, and that there's a gap in any of them. It isn't. So why in this particular case? And the biggest problem with the gap theory is contextual in terms of Daniel chapter 9. What precipitates Daniel 9? What's the lead up? What is Daniel reading in order to come to the conclusion that the end of the 70 years of captivity is on the horizon? Now, how could he say that? He could say that because 70 means 70. So, Daniel chapter 9, verse 1, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So here you have an encapsulated form, the desolations, and you find the same thing in Matthew 23 and 24 talking about desolations. So verse 3 of Daniel 9, so I gave my attention to the Lord to seek him in prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. Now, what did he determine? Where did he go? He went to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So you got 70 years at the beginning of the chapter, which are actually 70 years, and you have 70 weeks of years at the end of the chapter, but all of a sudden it's 69, 2,000 years, and then the 70th. All of a sudden this all changes. 70 really doesn't mean 70, but it meant 70 to Jeremiah. It meant 70 to Daniel, but somehow it doesn't mean 70 to us. It means 69 plus 2,000 plus 7, or 1 in terms of years, 7 years. You really have to, anybody who claims to interpret the Bible literally, how they get away with this, I don't know. The only way they do it is by importing a constructed prophetic system based upon all kinds of unhistorical, non-literal, and non-grammatical interpretation. We're talking about grammar here. 70 years, 70 weeks of years. Each of these is a unit. In fact, I think the Hebrew grammar, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people. It's a singular. It's that unit of 70 there is a singular. It's not something that you can manipulate and turn into 69, a gap, and then 70. You are importing into a text. That's what eisegesis really is. You are putting into a text things that aren't there. And not only are you putting a gap in there, you are putting the Antichrist in there, this covenant with the Jews supposedly, of course, the rebuilding another temple. All of those elements are there. And so the question is, how was the Daniel's 70 weeks of prophecy fulfilled? And I'll talk about that in the next podcast on this, because what we've got to do is ask the particulars of Daniel chapter 9, 24 through 27. What does it mean that the Messiah was to die the death of a covenant breaker for us? What does it mean, this cutting off that took place? What does it mean now after 69 weeks? What does it mean to finish the transgression? What does it mean to to make an end to sin? What does it mean to make reconciliation, that is atonement for iniquity? What does it mean to bring in everlasting righteousness? All these things have to be dealt with. What does it mean to seal up the vision and prophecy? What does it mean to anoint the most holy, either the most holy one or the most holy place? All of these things are in there, and we can determine what they mean not by importing an existing manufactured eschatological system, but allowing Scripture to interpret Scripture by following the grammar and looking at things exegetically. So we'll cover those details in the 54th episode of Bible Prophecy Under the Microscope.
Thanks for podcasting with Gary DeMar. Please subscribe and share this with anyone you think really needs to hear it.